Even if you don't know your IQ, the way that we think about intelligence is based in the logic of intelligence tests, and that kind of logic pervades our culture in ways that are pretty pernicious.
I just like it because I think it's helpful to explain to teachers and to parents and to the individuals themselves, here's how your brain works.
Taking this one definition of intelligence and putting it up as on this high pedestal, you do miss out on a lot of other gifts that we see that are outside of that.
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each episode, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, who do we consider intelligent and why?
The first time I really started thinking about IQ tests really was the first IEP meeting I had for my daughter when she started kindergarten.
Pepper Stetler is a professor of art history at Miami University in Ohio, and she's author of a memoir called A Measure of Intelligence, One Mother's Reckoning with the IQ Test.
So my daughter Louisa has Down syndrome, and a IEP or individualized education program is a kind of document that sets out the accommodations, the kinds of things that the school district is going to do to allow her to kind of access learning with her peers in a regular classroom. The school psychologist kind of said to me, well, you know, her IQ is low, but it's actually pretty high for a kid with Down syndrome. It was an awkward moment because I think he was trying to kind of like soften the conversation for me a little bit. And I kind of took the bait, and in my head, I think I was like, yes. It somehow made me feel good in a way that I eventually found kind of icky. Like I was a good mother because my kid had a high IQ, and kind of things like that I wanted to really grapple with, and I wanted other people to grapple with too, which is why I think I wanted to write the book.
IQ scores carry a lot of meaning in American society. To be considered high IQ is more than book learning or street smarts. It's a statement of worth, of potential to be successful in ways we find meaningful. But most of us have no idea what our actual IQ score is, because it's not something a 30-question online quiz can tell you. It takes an official test, often administered over the course of several hours by a psychologist with special graduate-level training. So IQ tests these days are mainly given in the context of diagnosing an intellectual disability or some sort of deficit at school. Roughly 1 million U.S. public school kids every year get an IQ test as part of the IEP process to identify what support they need. But all of us are influenced by the prevalence of measuring IQ, whether we know our score or not, because the resulting number is only meaningful in comparison to other people. Those of us, and it's most of us if we're being honest, walking around thinking we're on the higher end of the IQ spectrum, have nothing to feel good about unless there's also a low end of the spectrum, right? And also some sense of what's normal. Well, today on Top of Mind, we're probing this concept of intelligence that we value so highly. Where did it come from? And how does it continue to shape our lives? So, Pepper Stetler,
author of the book A Measure of Intelligence,
only started thinking seriously about this when she became pregnant and learned that her unborn child had Down syndrome.
I am a white, upper class, very, very educated college professor, and I had a lot of expectations about how my daughter would belong in that same kind of world.
Stetler adjusted her expectations and quickly came to see her daughter Louisa as having differences, not deficits. But hearing the school psychologist pronounce Louisa's IQ as, quote, high for a child with Down syndrome shook her thinking.
Reflecting back on it now, high test scores to me means success, right? And it establishes our worth and value in society, and it also establishes where we belong in society. I think my book is not somehow trying to argue that my daughter should somehow do better on an IQ test, or like the IQ test isn't testing her accurately. Like that's not what I believe. I think it's probably pretty accurate in the things that it tests, but also like we as a society have decided to value the things that it tests. Pattern recognition, short-term memory, efficiency, speed and processing, all of those kinds of things that I think not coincidentally make someone a good worker and a successful worker in the modern world.
What does the IQ test not capture about Louisa?
Yeah. There's a lot that it doesn't capture about Louisa. She's in 7th grade now. It doesn't capture her interest in community and her interest in connections. She loves school. She comes in every day and, greets the teacher with enthusiasm and is happy to be there in ways that I think, 7th graders often get a bit dour with the teenage years coming up. And so far, I think Louisa has a kind of positivity that's appreciated by her teachers. She loves learning. It's just in a way that learning doesn't necessarily look like it does for other people. And I think writing this book was a kind of way that I wanted to refuse that standard of learning that the IQ test sets up for us. Even if you don't know your IQ and you don't remember ever taking an official intelligence test, the way that we think about intelligence is based in the logic of intelligence tests, and that kind of logic pervades our culture in ways that are pretty pernicious in our world.
And Pepper Stetler found herself wondering where exactly the test had come from, which led her to the historical archives at the University of Akron and the papers of a key figure in the story of the IQ test, a psychologist named Henry Goddard.
The IQ test was developed in France around the beginning of the 20th century, around 1905-06, by a man named Alfred Binet. And at this time, France had started to require public education for all French children. And Binet was asked to develop a test that could identify kids that might need a little bit more help in school. So he kind of decided, what is normal, say, for a 5-year-old to be able to do? What is normal for a 9-year-old to be able to do? And then tested children based on that kind of normal sense of age development. And then eventually there was an American psychologist named Henry Goddard who visited France, learned about Binet's methods and tests, and wanted to bring it back to the United States. But basically his purpose for doing this was kind of the opposite of Binet's, in the sense that he wanted to use this test to basically kind of segregate what was called at the time feeble-minded children from the normal children that should be allowed to be in public educational classrooms. And so he developed this kind of hierarchy where, a child with an intelligence less than comparable to a 2-year-old was what he called an idiot. Intelligence from a 3 to 7-year-old was called an imbecile. Intelligence of a child from 8 to 12 was called a moron. And this kind of last classification of the moron was one that he was particularly concerned with, because it was kind of the kid that could easily slip through the cracks and not be identified as feeble-minded and kind of persist in public education without us knowing. So this
cause harm to the detriment of the other students.
Waste the resources of the teacher and the school basically just by being there, and not being as good of a student and not being able to keep up and so forth. it caught on like wildfire. Not only did it kind of create the standard for the segregation and even institutionalization of children with intellectual disabilities for the rest of the 20th century, it also was the beginning of the eugenics movement, right? So Goddard goes even further and basically says that we need to find these feeble-minded people in our society and sterilize them so they do not continue breeding, and the American identity can be kind of purified in that way.
The American eugenics movement fell into the shadows after World War II, when the world discovered what the Nazis had done. Hitler had, in fact, been inspired by the American eugenicists. Quietly, though, many states maintained forced sterilization programs for decades, targeting people affected by mental illness, disability, poverty, or a criminal record. Meanwhile, the IQ test took on a separate life of its own, mainly as a tool for identifying disability in students like Stetler's daughter, Louisa.
The purpose has been flipped to some degree, right? Like the test is something that, like I said before, gives her access to an inclusive educational experience by kind of outlining how she can be supported in a classroom. But, there's also lots of ways in which I have found that the kind of logic of intelligence tests is still part of the way in which she is evaluated and treated at school. Like there is I have found that there is a remarkably persistent way in which her progress is quantified in a way that her other peers don't have to go through in such an intense way.
Like what? Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so I just had a conversation with her school where they are trying to quantify her ability to stay on task in a classroom. And so there is a educator that has measured that she is on track in a classroom 42% of the time, whereas her peer that she is judged against, who is kind of the normal peer, is measured to be on track 70% of the time. And to me, like I completely object to this kind of quantification of her time in a classroom. It implies a certain demand for almost a robotic sense of attention. And who is this teacher to say when my daughter is or is not paying attention, just because she might pay attention in a way that's different than what is normally considered to look like attention. And also, it's again a kind of metric that is only there to describe her detriment, right? Like there's nothing I can do about the fact that my daughter has Down syndrome, and therefore she's going to have issues with attention and focus in a classroom. And rather than measuring that and reinforcing her difference and detriment, maybe the classroom could change.
And would that be fair to her classmates? If the classroom has to change to accommodate Louisa's needs?
Yeah, I think it would. I mean, honestly, most kids don't necessarily do well with the expectations of a classroom today. I also think that all different kinds of ways of learning can be honored at a classroom at a particular time. There doesn't have to be one way of learning. And honestly, I don't think that my daughter being in a classroom is a hindrance to anyone else's learning at all. I think having difference in a classroom teaches people community. It teaches people how to learn with others who don't learn like you. And this is kind of what I wish was valued more in what I see in the educational system, is valuing that kind of community, teaching, interaction, involvement with people that learn differently than you, rather than worrying about someone's test scores and whether that matches normal.
Is she continually getting the IQ test? How often does she need to have that?
Yeah, so the rules go that she needs to have it every 3 years. And, this is also something that I've really struggled with is it's required for her IEP. I think I could potentially refuse it and say, no, I'm not having Louisa take this IQ test anymore. But it also qualifies her for Medicaid later in her life if she needs it. It qualifies her for Social Security if she needs it later in her life. And so there's this strange bind where I realized ways in which it could cause potential discrimination against Louisa, but also I was dependent on it at the same time. And something that I realized while writing the book was that whether or not I have her take an IQ test, the kinds of assumptions and stereotypes we have about the ability of people with intellectual disabilities to contribute to our world will still persist, right? And changing that kind of involves changing the way that people think about intelligence.
So what is the system that you would prefer to see? Is it a system with no assessment, no testing? Is it a system where nobody gets a score?
Yeah, I mean, I guess realistically, I don't think IQ tests are going away, but I do wish that they could be minimized, and the kind of information that is gleaned from an IQ test, I would like to see it, I guess, deprioritized for social skills. I think our mind shift as a society needs to turn to understanding that a person is valuable and deserves care no matter what their cognitive assessment score is, and to really move towards thinking about how that person could be accommodated by doing things like funding Medicaid services, providing more places in which people with intellectual disabilities can lead fulfilling lives as part of a community rather than worrying about things like achievement, success, independence that are really kind of valued in an IQ test.
Just finally, Pepper, what is your hope for Louisa as you think about her future?
Yeah, I want her to find happiness. I am not so concerned with her ability to be independent. I think whatever way she wants to live in the future, however much she needs me and my husband, her father, to support and help her, that's fine. But I also want a world that can help her have the most fulfilling life possible. And for me, that means things like giving her enough education to be aware of her identity and her place in the world, and also her ability to find meaningful work, I think depends on not just her, but on the ability of our world to kind of see her as a valuable member of her community.
Some of that then entails her being part of the system, you encouraging her to play the game.
Yeah, exactly. And so therefore it seems more valuable to me to ask people to rethink the system rather than trying to pull her out of it.
Pepper Stetler is the author of A Measure of Intelligence, One Mother's Reckoning with the IQ Test. She's also a professor of art history at Miami University. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing your story today.
Thanks for speaking with me, Julie. I appreciate it.
So if the IQ test is such a narrow measure of a person's potential or ability to contribute to society, why does it persist as a requirement for diagnosing intellectual disability and a tool for identifying students in need of support?
I think it's helpful to explain to teachers and to parents and to the individuals themselves, here's how your brain works, and here's what is harder for you. So we're going to use your strengths to kind of overcome some of these weaknesses in everyday life.
The case for IQ testing is next on Top of Mind from the BYU Radio Podcast Network. I'm Julie Rose. Hey friends, I would like to take just a moment and introduce you to another show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's The Lisa Show. Lisa Valentine Clark is the host. She's a comedian, actress, believer, single mom. And the show delves into the multitude of challenges that shape our lives, whether it's parenting, mental health questions, social issues. Lisa and the Council of Moms will tackle it and do it with a lot of laughs along the way as we attempt to figure out this thing called life. So check out The Lisa Show. Listen wherever you get podcasts.
I'm Teresa Gabrielson,
School psychologist.
So I am a school psychologist. I've worked in schools, in hospitals, in clinics, and I'm now teaching at the university.
At Brigham Young University, where she teaches future school psychologists how to administer IQ tests. In fact, the IQ test is a big reason school psychology exists.
Our profession and our discipline was actually created with the passage of IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act.
That 1970s law guaranteed a free, appropriate public education for all children with disabilities, which meant that schools needed a trained professional available to test students for intellectual and learning disabilities.
IQ testing in particular is the realm of psychologists, and that's how school psychology was born.
So what is the point then of an IQ test in a scenario like that, where the child seems to be struggling?
It helps me to pinpoint where the issue is. A lot of people think an IQ test is a single score, and that's actually the overall score that you get. Like my IQ is this number, is the least meaningful piece of information in the whole test, as far as I'm concerned. I'm more concerned with how is your working memory? So when I tell you something, are you remembering it or is it gone? And I have to find a better way to get things into your memory. I look at your processing speed. When information comes in through your eyes or through your ears, how quickly are you able to take that information and work with it? I look at your fluid reasoning, your ability to take novel information and figure out the pattern and predict what comes next. So if you think of problem solving in daily life, fluid reasoning tells you that. Visual spatial, a lot of people are highly talented in visual spatial skills. And if that's the case, we want to use a lot more visual spatial inputs in our teaching with them. And verbal comprehension is what you've learned, like what you've been exposed to. Did you grow up reading? Did you grow up in a rich language environment? Do you have access to books and reading? Have you been in school? Have you been in the hospital for a year and you've missed all this stuff? All of those things, including working memory, can help us better teach you and educate you so you can go farther faster in your education.
And you can assess all of that even in a child as young as, what, 6?
So we can start looking at that very early in development, but as you can imagine, very young children are highly variable. So if we get any kind of a score under age 6, we know that that's not going to be very predictive. And we know it has the potential to not be predictive. After age 6, when children have been exposed to a school system and they're kind of understanding that they're trying to do their best, we find that over time, IQ tends to be stable. However, it's not always perfect. So we do, like in the school system even, we do want to look every 3 years at least to see if anything in their IQ has changed. And it may have been the original test was not ideal, and it may have been a later test is not ideal, but we're looking at it over time to make sure we really know what their strengths and weaknesses are and that we're on the right track. We have other ways to look at that, but IQ test is one way.
Is it one of the best ways?
A lot of people would argue curriculum-based measurement is a better way. So like show us your work on a daily basis versus let's see how you can do in a standardized environment. Some children don't respond well to standardized environment, and they may not be at their best in the 1 to 2 hours that I would see them for an IQ test. So, I mean, the bottom line is no, none of these measures are perfect.
What would you think about eliminating IQ tests from the process of identifying a student's needs?
So that has been done in a couple of scenarios. Some states have adopted models in their state rules to meet the needs of the federal law. that do not require IQ tests. And there's a famous law case called Larry P. versus Riles in California, where Black students cannot be administered an IQ test because they've been deemed to be biased. So is it possible? Sure. You need to gather a lot more information. There's a lot more ecological information where you're looking at them in their own environment when they're comfortable and what are they able to do. We're measuring how their academic outputs. It's longer, harder, but it's certainly possible to get that information without an IQ test.
You would prefer, though, to be able to use it as one input or an important input?
I just like it because I can see what's going on in their brains in terms of what kind of inputs are best for you and what type of information do you have the best reaction to. And then I can take that information and granted, I'm kind of extrapolating it into the real world, but I think it's helpful to explain to teachers and to parents and to the individuals themselves, here's how your brain works. And here's what is harder for you. So we're going to use your strengths to kind of overcome some of these weaknesses in everyday life so that you can feel more successful. And I've seen that from preschoolers to adults. Even our university students, we've been able to help them.
But Professor Gabrielson also feels strongly that an IQ score should not be used as a cutoff point, where people above get this opportunity and people below get this one.
Right. From the very beginning, from Theodore Simon and Alfred Binet in 1905, they were using an IQ test ostensibly to support students who needed different supports, but they were dividing them. So they were dividing educable students from not educable students. So they were using it to divide students out of classrooms that they didn't think could benefit, and they put him on a different path. That idea continued through the Army. There were different IQ tests given to some soldiers than others, and depending on the outcome, they could become officers, they could be frontline, they could be underutilized because of their scores, and it was all biased. So like the dividing nature of IQ is false. I mean, in my mind. It was even used for immigrants at Ellis Island at some point. Like, these people we're not going to let into the country. These people we are going to let into the country.
But you also find the IQ test to be very helpful in the work that you do, in serving kids. And so how do you make peace with that? Because you are administering IQ tests that do result in a total number. And so you're perpetuating the use of the IQ test, even though it also is frequently used in this other way that you don't like.
There's two approaches that you can take, and one is kind of a technicality. The way, like, the statistical analysis of the test can actually suggest to you that the full-scale number is not going to be representative, so don't even report it. So that's one option. But the better option is...
So you've actually chosen, you can choose to just not tell the parent,
yeah,
this is your child's IQ.
Yeah, especially if the analysis says, like, their abilities are so broadly varied, a full-scale score is not going to be informative, so don't use it. But I think a better way is to talk about the person and the person's abilities with them or their parents. And then if the parents always have access to the scores, but I never talk about them. I talk about the person and what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, maybe how they compare with peers, and what the scores might tell us in terms of the level of supports that we need to provide for them. But I don't bring the scores to importance by talking about them very much. I show them, I don't hide them, but that's not what my conversation is. More than once, the parent has walked in, and before we even start the meeting says, don't tell me he's low. Don't tell me she's low. I can't stand to hear that one more time. And so we worked with that. We put them into a scenario and say, so you know your child best. We found out this. Does that match your experience? Like, without support, would your child be able to do this the same as his or her peers? And they agree, like, oh no, they would need support. I'm like, that's what we found out, that this is the area they need the most support in. And that if we put them in a situation without support, this is kind of telling us they're not going to survive and thrive. So we need to change how we're educating them. And just changing the words that I use has made a huge difference with parents. We didn't change the facts at all.
Teresa Gabrielson is a school psychologist and professor at Brigham Young University. Now, we need to talk about another big change the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 1975 brought to the way intelligence is understood in America. See, once all struggling students were being carefully assessed under that law, diagnoses of autism and learning disabilities jumped dramatically. The psychiatric field, in turn, began to more clearly differentiate between intellectual disability, which is typically involved an IQ score lower than 70, and other disabilities that affect how the brain works, but aren't consistently reflected in an IQ test. Autism, for example. Prior to the 1970s, most people with that diagnosis were also assumed to be intellectually disabled. But autism has since been reclassified as a spectrum disorder with a much wider range of symptoms. Today, only about a third of kids with autism spectrum disorder also have intellectual disability.
I do think that's an overestimation because IQ tests are designed and administered assuming that people have sort of neurotypical motor skills and communication skills.
So, what is the effect of that bias on people who communicate and interact differently from society's norm? People with autism, for example, or dyslexia. That's next. I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind, a BYU Radio podcast. Hey, it's Julie, inviting you to embark on a whimsical journey with The Appleseed from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. Immerse yourself in captivating stories, expertly woven by talented storytellers. Join host Sam Payne and the live studio audience in laughter and delight as they explore a tapestry of tales. Tune in to The Appleseed for a family-friendly experience that sparks imagination and brings stories to life. It's your ticket to fun and creativity. Find The Appleseed wherever you listen to podcasts.
So between times when I was like age 11 to 13, I had a lot of trouble in school.
This is Quincy Hansen, autism and neurodiversity advocate.
I actually had to be removed like in the middle of the year in like an emergency intervention in 7th grade. And that's because I just could not function in a school environment because I was having trouble with like the sensory environment. And like that manifested in me as like really, really super high anxiety. And of course I would have like meltdowns. I exhibit self-harm a lot when I melt down, so I hit myself and I'll bang my head on things. And I make a lot of noise and there's a lot of tears. And basically I feel like I'm not in control of my body, which is really scary.
That mid-year intervention when he was 12 included an assessment for autism and an IQ test.
I was never told what the score was, but from the way that people acted, I think it wasn't very good. And the people who actually gave it and gave the thing like, yeah, we did this IQ test, but we don't think this is an actual reflection. Like you're smarter than what it would show, and like it's not a good measure.
Now, a big reason to think that was a much higher score already in his file.
I was given an IQ test really early when I was in like elementary school as part of gifted talented testing. And like that's how they recognize me as twice exceptional. And so that basically means developmentally disabled but intellectually gifted.
It's not surprising that Hansen was given an IQ test during his official autism assessment. That is really common, even though an IQ score is not part of the criteria for a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. It's also common for an autistic child's scores to be all over the place from one test to the next, like they were for Hansen.
So the thing about IQ tests is that they are very, very subjective. In that it's not like we're plugging probes into your brain and like there's some like magic intelligence juice or whatever. It's the big thing with autism that it's bias communication. and that autistic people actually, by the diagnostic definition, as a result of the way that we process sensory information, have trouble communicating, or at least communicating with non-autistic people. And so if you can't communicate for whatever multitude of reasons your answers to the person giving the IQ test, then you're not going to score as high, even if you actually, quote unquote, know the answer. And the way that questions are worded they're culturally biased, for one. If you take an IQ test and you're from a culture that was different than the person who wrote it, you actually do score lower than that, regardless. But autistic people oftentimes interpret things differently. So, like, for example, you might ask on an IQ test, and this is one that I read. It was designed for like small children, so the question is really simple, but the question is like, oh, what color is grass? And the answer that they're looking for is, oh, grass is green. But like grass changes color. And so like if you're just outside in the wintertime and the grass is dormant and you're like, oh, I just saw the grass, it's brown. And you give that answer, well, that's like, oh, they don't know what color grass is. But it's sort of more complex than that for people who kind of tend to think more black and white and literally.
The picture of intelligence reinforced by the IQ test leaves little room then for someone who processes information and communicates differently. Someone like Quincy Hansen, who by all objective measures was not capable of academic success in 7th grade.
I was remedial, like elementary level math when I should have been learning algebra, and I had really low standardized test scores. And then meanwhile, I take a year in 8th grade and I actually took college classes at a community college because my parents thought I was smart. And in 8th grade, I got an A in college level intro biology and an A in college level English composition.
What made the difference?
It's environment. I was taking fewer classes, so I didn't have to be, I was in a class for like, I think 3 hours total, 3 times a week, instead of doing classes for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And the people there, like, you know how middle school students are, and that they're hooligans. And so there was less, input, and like I was being picked on. And, there were kids who were disrupting the class, which was negatively impacting me, which was kind of ironic because I was apparently a classroom disruption. But you don't have that in a college environment. College instructors, don't care about if you're sitting still at your desk. Or Quincy, you need to be looking at the whiteboard, whereas it doesn't matter, what my body language is in a lecture hall.
So the next year, Hansen switched to a private high school where he ended up graduating valedictorian in 4 years. And he started a blog to debunk stereotypes about autism.
The two biggest ways that I see that, first is thinking of autism as like the social awkwardness disorder, but it actually has to do with the way that the brain processes like sensory input. And so the second stereotype that I see a lot is that it's like basically like mental incapacitation, which is not a great, very sensitive way to phrase it, but that's what people think of it as. I find that a lot of the times in group discussions, just in my university classes, that people often assume that I am not as smart as I actually am. And that's because I have trouble I'm much better in writing. And so I have trouble finding the words for things on the fly and also like articulating ideas kind of verbally. And so like in a group setting or having a discussion in class, I know for a fact that I've had some people who have assumed that like I just didn't know what I was talking about or I wasn't very smart.
And when in fact, do your grades prove otherwise? Or?
Oh yeah, I'm going to graduate. I'm going to graduate magna cum laude here in December. I have nearly a perfect 4.0 if I wouldn't have gotten an A- in organic chemistry lab. But
now that he's finished his undergraduate at Colorado State University, he's planning to get a PhD in evolutionary developmental biology.
And I've written a book, Shake It Up, How to Be Young Autistic and Make an Impact, which is about empowering other autistic young people to kind of make a difference in their community and be advocates for themselves.
So do you consider yourself to have a disability because you're an autistic person?
I do. But I also subscribe to the social model of disability, which is basically this idea that what makes a disability disabling is the way in which the world is set up. And so I'm not disabled because I'm autistic necessarily. I'm disabled because I'm autistic in a world that expects you to be neurotypical. And you can even extend this to like physical disabilities. And I often like look at other organisms, like people who are blind. Like no one questions that being blind is a disability. But is it a disability because being blind is inherently a bad thing? Well, not necessarily. There are lots of successful organisms that are blind. It's possible to live and to be very successful in your world being blind. But the reason why it's a disability is because society and civilization is set up for people who can see. So same with autism. There's nothing inherently wrong with being autistic and with processing the information that comes in differently and integrating information, sensory information differently. But it becomes a disability because we're in a world that's set up for neurotypical people.
What would you say is the damage that's done? What's the harm of having this very specific notion of intelligence and neuronormality?
Well, for one thing, because intelligence is not just one thing, you miss out on potential benefits to society from people who don't meet this classical definition. In that there's a kind of a slogan about how the world needs all kinds of minds. And so there's an argument to be made just from the collective greater good that when you focus in on this one definition of intelligence and want to exclude and write off anyone who doesn't meet that, you're missing out on potential benefits from people who might have other skills, like skills in the arts or skills theologically, or who are pious, if that's a value that's important to you, or people who are very empathetic. And so by taking this one definition of intelligence and putting it up as on this high pedestal and writing off anybody who doesn't meet that as worthless or as worth less, you do miss out on a lot of other gifts. And the world works better when we have all kinds of minds and perspectives. So why would we limit ourselves as just a species?
Quincy Hansen, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it.
I'm really glad. Thank you.
Quincy Hansen is an autism and neurodiversity advocate, and his book is Shake It Up: How to Be Young, Autistic, and Make an Impact. So let's turn finally to learning disabilities, which are also often confused with low IQ. Dyslexia is the most common. And here, too, the IQ test has had a profound impact, but in the opposite way you're probably thinking. For many decades in America, the standard way to identify dyslexia was to look for kids who struggled to read but scored high on an IQ test, not low.
I started to struggle with reading early on.
Initially, none of Tim Odegaard's teachers even realized he had a problem, though.
You can memorize the words that you're hearing others read because there's a lot of heavy repetition in the books. So I would learn to memorize by sight how you pronounce the words. And when it was my turn to read for the group, I was looking as if I was one of the top readers in the class because my default wasn't to try to figure out how to sound out and pronounce the words. It was to see them and then call them out by sight. But by the third grade, and when my family relocated to Texas, it was pretty obvious to the education system there that I was well below expectation and that they knew that I couldn't read and spell very well. So I did formal testing for identification through the school, and that didn't go so well for me. The IQ test came back as pretty low. The discrepancy between my IQ and my underperformance wasn't great enough.
So the question was, is he struggling because he has a learning disability, or is he struggling because his IQ isn't high?
Exactly. They determined it was because I just don't have enough cognitive aptitude. I don't have the ability to do much better.
You couldn't have a learning disability, you just weren't smart.
Correct. But to boil it down, I didn't meet eligibility requirements, and I was never identified with a reading disability or dyslexia.
The so-called discrepancy model to identify dyslexia was the federal government's recommended approach until 2004. But it is still legal in many states, and a 2018 survey found about a third of school psychologists nationwide said they were still using it. There's no telling how many kids like Odegaard have been left to their own devices as a result of the reliance on IQ testing.
I felt lousy. I felt shame. I didn't know what was going on because nobody took the time to explain to me why I was being tested for any of this. And I was forced to stay after school in the third grade for an extra hour. And I used that time to try to figure out what the meanings of the passages were that I was expected to read from what I was able to read, and also infer what words might be based off of that. So I got really good at memorizing the words that I could hear, just asking the right questions of people around me, looking for any context clue that I could. So I got really good at extracting meaning. It's not surprising that I grew up to be a research scientist because we make inferences on limited data and we make hypotheses that we test. And I'm actually a really good one of those. I don't view dyslexia as a gift, but I do know that I was forced to have to compensate and adapt to my environment in ways that had me strengthen things that I could do to a very fine edge.
That seems like a demonstration of pretty advanced cognitive ability. Why did the IQ test identify you as not very intellectually capable?
Because of the type of testing that's done isn't going to look for that type of intellect. So one of the hallmarks and one of the characteristics that's linked to these issues with word level reading and spelling are memory issues with working memory. So I can't hold in my short-term memory for auditory information strings of words, strings of numbers, sounds. And when you're trying to learn novel words, or if you're trying to hold information to go from print to sound to meaning, it makes it challenging if the workspace in your mind that you have to work with is limited in that area. So much of what you have to do on an IQ test requires either listening to and then repeating back, or verbally relabeling things in your mind's ear, sounds that you then use to then solve problems. And then the other example would be my background and cultural upbringing. I come from a very blue-collar background. I know a lot about a lot of things, but I wouldn't have known a lot of different kind of academic vocabulary is what we would call it in kind of technical terms. So I wasn't being exposed in my home to the same types of words and language that you were being exposed to in other people's homes with, let's say, college-educated families. Didn't mean that my family wasn't knowledgeable about a lot of things, but the knowledge that is prized for vocabulary and background knowledge on a vocabulary test at that time in particular, and still to this day, is very limited to be from a very specific cultural background.
Tim Odegaard is now a professor of psychology and chair of excellence in dyslexic studies at Middle Tennessee State University. He advocates for a kind of instructional screening that involves intensive early help with phonics for all kids and increasing that support for students who continue to struggle, like he's done for his own son.
I intervened from birth with my son. He never presented with the same types of some of the language differences that I did, but when it came to putting language sounds to print, he still struggled. So he got academic intervention for an intensive period of time, intensively for several years. Now, he also was able to get an IQ test because one of the school psych students needed to do IQ testing. His cultural background was much different than mine. The poor school psych student, several hours later, when she stumbled out tired from how far he took all those tests, was quite remarkable. He knew how to do school. He had two college-educated parents to talk to him who used all this advanced language around him. He had spent so much time learning all of this stuff. So much of what we measure on the IQ test is culturally driven by your learning opportunities as well, just to get back to that whole intelligence thing.
So he scored highly on the intelligence test then?
He did.
And so there was clearly enough of a discrepancy that even under that model, he would qualify as having a learning disability.
Yeah, my son would have. One generation removed, economic opportunities, educational opportunities, creating a different household for him, created a context for protective factors that set him up for a different profile than what I had.
You've used the word language differences. Would you reject the word deficiency?
So it's a deficiency if you think about it for what we need for reading. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people in the space that I exist in the dyslexia community and kind of advocates for people with learning differences, neurodiversities, don't like anything that feels like it's a negative. But you do have to acknowledge that when it comes to learning how to read words and spell words, the language the language differences that you see in individuals with dyslexia are definitely deficiencies when you think about what we're expected to be able to do in normal life, in normal school days. We have to communicate with others in both oral language and written language.
And how do you think about the concept of normal? Like is there such a thing, do you think, as a normal way of processing language? And then there's dyslexia, which is not normal, I guess, by extension?
So in a Western educated society like the United States or Canada, for example, it is normal to be literate. It is normal to communicate in written language. So the sense of what is normal is always going to be culturally defined by the population and also societally what we need. If we rewound ourselves 200 years ago, it wouldn't have been unusual for a child growing up in the United States not to have been able to have read. It would have been perfectly normal for me and for my son to have found other professions in which we could have expressed ourselves. And our differences would have laid dormant and potentially never manifested themselves. So what has become normal and normalized for our society has shifted dramatically. If we went 30 years ago, being computer literate and knowing how to use a computer wouldn't have been a normal skill that a person would have had. I had an IBM PC Junior that we managed to acquire at a fairly early age. And I learned how to program BASIC. And when the same time I wasn't doing well on an IQ test, I was picking up the DOS manuals, deciphering what this meant, and I was sequencing then within a few years the music I was learning in my music programs into the computer and having the computer play it to me, all before I was, 11. So it wasn't normal, and I was abnormal to be able to do all those things, right? Yeah. I was actually truly exceptional. But it's society that determines what's normal.
Why were you able to do all those things? Like, why were you able to learn, basic coding language if you couldn't read?
Because that's symbolic but not linked to any kind of sound structure of the language. Music is tonal. I could learn how to read music and play music. I played sax and clarinet, and I went to school on a music scholarship for college. Those are all different skill sets. You might capture that as musical intelligence, and Mozart would have been a super genius that he was. Jacqueline Dupree was a musical genius for what she was able to emote through her cello. Our societal notion of what intelligence is and how we express it is extremely limited in how we measure it on an IQ test. Yeah. And it does not capture a person's potential for something that would be of value to society.
Professor Odegaard, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Tim Odegaard is a leading expert on dyslexia research. He's editor-in-chief of the Annals of Dyslexia and a professor of psychology at Middle Tennessee State University. Have you previously thought much about IQ in your own life? I was surprised to realize while working on this episode that I actually have no idea what my IQ score really is. And yet, I also realized just how much my sense of self is tied to being seen as highly intelligent in conventional IQ test kinds of ways. More than I'd previously noticed. Certainly more than I'm now comfortable with. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Email topofmind@byu.edu and let me know. You can also connect with us on social media. We are at Top of Mind Pod. And over on Instagram, I'm frequently posting behind the scenes and insights related to the topics we're covering here on Top of Mind. You can find me I_M_Julie_Rose on Instagram. And be sure to check out my other podcast, Uncomfy, where we're exploring what it means to lean into moments that challenge us and why it's worth the discomfort. You can watch Uncomfy on YouTube and Spotify. It's a video podcast, or just listen on your favorite app. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Elena Beck and me, with help from James Hoops, Samuel Benson, and Sam Payne. Our audio engineer and sound design team includes Brandon Lewis and Gabe Vargas. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.